as you can wear them along. Oh, good. So they're made for you.
It's hard to find suits that are made for people with 10-foot arms.
That you like, right? Where do you go?
Encore Custom Tailors. It's a couple blocks north of Macy's.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Mark's always had trouble getting. What do you think of the block?
I haven't looked too deeply. I was at basketball.
That's right. That's a real plus.
Good morning. Hi, Kate. My name is Clover. We're glad you are here. This is the first of 8 weeks on the Bible. How many of you, I love the Bible. How many of you have heard Tim Beal before teach? Oh, good. Well, I should say, how many of you haven't heard Tim Beal? How many of you heard this lecture before? Yeah, about 7 years ago. Anyway, we're so glad you are here. Thank you. This is Tim Beal from Case Western Reserve University. He commutes to Cleveland every couple weeks. He's a professor of religious studies there. He happens to be my husband. And we're in the Bible business. That's what we do. We get paid for this. And we're so lucky. So Tim, thank you so much for leading us off for the first few weeks on the introduction to the New Testament. Thank you all for being here, and we trust it will be a great session. Thanks.
Thanks. Great to see you all. I'm a little bit too tall for this. I hope you can hear me okay. It's not super close. The mic isn't. Is that all right? Good, good. Great to see you all. This is my first time up here, I think. But our daughter got married here a couple weeks ago in this space, and I really love it. It's a beautiful place. So great to see you all. And as Clover mentioned in worship, this is the beginning of a series, I think 8 sessions, and don't worry, I'm not doing 8 on the New Testament. I'm going to do 3 of them. And so the first one is really just a broad, general introduction to the New Testament. And then the next one I do will be on fairly broad introduction to the Gospels, the 4 Gospels in the New Testament. And then I think the third we're going to do parables. So those will be the pieces that I am part of. And so I'm just going to dive in so that we have some time to talk afterwards, hopefully. I should have my phone so I can track the time a little bit. You might recognize this scene from Jesus Christ Superstar, a movie that I love. And it's just a way of getting at a few basic questions about the New Testament. So what is the New Testament? Who is responsible for it? We could say who wrote it, but it's more complicated than that. Where did it come from? How did it get here? When did it come from? And then finally, up there in the upper left, we'll reflect a little bit on WWJR. What would Jesus read, or what would Jesus have read back then? So we'll just dive in on the what. Oops, no, we're not going to do that yet. I forgot. I want to start with a song. It is a song called Jesus Was Way Cool by King Missile, and in order to play it, I'm going to need to pull up my Spotify, and hopefully it'll work. Just a second. You get to see my listening habits. Don't speak too soon about that. Okay. I'm not getting any sound.
You're on mute.
I am? It's bottom right. No, that's volume's all the way up. That's mute. That's not mute. This is often happens with the HDMI. Huh? Just skip it? Okay. Oh, it's really, you know what? It's not really a, oh, here, I got an idea. Hold on. I'm going to quit that, go back into that again, find it on my phone. Just a sec. So this is a song, I've played this song for my students since I started teaching. So it's from the 90s. All right, here we go. How's that?
Jesus was way cool. Everybody liked Jesus. Everybody wanted to hang out with him. Anything he wanted to do, he did. He turned water into wine, and if he wanted to, he could have turned weed into marijuana, or sugar into cocaine, or vitamin pills into amphetamines. He walked on the water and swam on the land. He would tell these stories, and people would listen. He was really cool. If you were blind or lame, you just went to Jesus, and he would put his hands on you, and you would be healed. That's so cool. He could have played guitar better than Hendrix. He could have told the future. He could have baked the most delicious cake in the world. He could have scored more goals than Wayne Gretzky. He could have danced better than Baryshnikov. Jesus could have been funnier than any comedian you can think of. Jesus was way cool. He told people to eat his body and drink his blood. That's so cool. Jesus was so cool. But then some people got jealous of how cool he was, so they killed him. But then he rose from the dead. He rose from the dead, danced around, and went up to heaven. I mean, that's so cool. Jesus was way cool. No wonder there are so many Christians.
It goes on just instrumentally for a while after that. I love that song so much. And it fits well with Jesus Christ Superstar, I think, too. So wanted to start with that. And now we'll go into the what, where, who, how, when. I forget the order. So first, what is the New Testament? Well, most importantly, it is not a book, but rather a collection. And that's true for the Bible in general, too. It's not a book that starts here and ends here. It's a collection, really more like a library than it is a book. And the New Testament has 27 documents in it, 4 Gospels, a bunch of letters, many of which were written by Paul. Some claim to have been written by Paul and probably were not, and others written by other people, and one anonymous one, Hebrews, and then also this apocalyptic text, the book of Revelation, or the Apocalypse of John. We don't have the originals of any of these documents that are in the New Testament now. The versions, the manuscript versions that we have come usually centuries later than when the original first versions were probably written, and then they were copied over time and shared in different communities. So we don't have the original documents of these texts. And importantly, there were many other Christian texts. There were many other texts circulating in the first century, in the second century, in the third century, in the fourth century that didn't make it into the New Testament, but that were very important and influential texts within different parts of the Jesus movement, which was a very diverse movement, both in Palestine and all around the Greco-Roman Empire. And different communities had different collections of early Christian texts. And they might have been the ones that are now in our New Testament. There might have been more than those. There might have been fewer than those. There might have been other than those. So that's important to keep in mind just historically. It's a kind of selection of sorts from all of the texts that were back then. Who is responsible for it? You could say who wrote it, but that's really it's more complicated than that. But we can talk about what we sometimes refer to as the Jesus movement before it was called Christianity. But this movement that grew, first with Jesus and his followers, which included disciples, but also probably a lot more followers than that. We know that that Mary Magdalene and other women who were there at the empty tomb and the different stories in the Gospels must have been important, and many other people who were probably followers and disciples. So that's where it emerges from, right? The New Testament texts. The Gospels that we'll talk about next time, the 4 Gospels that are in our New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and the Gospel of John, were all originally anonymous. They weren't written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, almost for sure not. But early on, these names of these disciples were attached to those Gospels, and that's probably part of how they gained greater influence and authority, by being associated with early disciples. But if you read them, nobody says, I, so-and-so, wrote this, or signs off at the end, or self-identifies in any way within these texts. They were originally anonymous. Paul wrote a lot of letters. Again, writing is kind of an interesting way to put it, because, for example, in one of them, the person taking sort of dictation for Paul says hi in the middle of the letter too. I, who am writing this down, also greet you. So writing was not exactly the way we write today, sitting by yourself, with a Moleskine or something, writing a letter to a congregation. But Paul did write many of the letters that are in the New Testament. Others were what we call pseudonymous letters. That is to say, they claim to be letters from Paul, but they probably were not. And we can talk about the arguments for why we make those kind of distinctions. But 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, almost for sure, while they claim to be letters written by Paul, probably were not. They have a different vocabulary. They seem to reflect a different time, much later than Paul, and some different theology in them and stuff like that makes us think that they're probably pseudonymous and not actually authentically Paul's letters. And then you've got John of Patmos, who is not the same as the John identified with the Gospel of John or with the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd letters of John. And we don't know much about who John of Patmos is, really anything other than what we have in the book of Revelation, that John of Patmos, we call him John of Patmos because he says, I, John, am on this island of Patmos while I'm writing this, right? So that's a little bit about the who. Where did it come from? Some of the New Testament texts certainly originated in Palestine, what was Judea at that time in the Roman Empire, and that's where Jesus lived his entire life. Probably never left, certainly never left Palestine, never left Judea. But then other texts, as the Jesus movement grew and spread throughout the Roman Empire, especially thanks to Paul, but also the book of Revelation, those come from other parts of the Roman Empire. The book of Revelation is associated with some church communities on the west coast of what's modern day Turkey now, because John in that text addresses those different churches that are along that coast. And then Paul's letters are addressed to different communities throughout the Roman Empire that he was ministering to as the gospel spread outside of Palestine and throughout the Roman Empire. When did it come from? The earliest texts in the New Testament, we might, if we just kind of were guessing, we might think the earliest texts would be the Gospels, right? Because those are the stories of Jesus, and they are attributed to the disciples who would have been around for a while, maybe after Jesus, and wrote these Gospels. But that's not the case. The earliest texts in the New Testament are Paul's letters, which come from the 50s and the 60s. CE means Common Era. We say that instead of AD because AD is the year of our Lord, so it's a very Christian way of dating things. CE just stands for Common Era, and BCE stands for before Common Era. So Paul's letters are the earliest texts that we have in the New Testament. dating to the middle of the 1st century. The earliest gospel, most would argue, there are a few who disagree, but most would argue that the Gospel of Mark is the earliest one and probably dates to around 70 Common Era. That's right around the time of the fall of the temple, the destruction of the temple by the Romans, the Jerusalem temple, that is. But others have different arguments about exactly when you date Mark. We'll talk more about the Gospels and their relationship with one another next time, but part of the reason we most would argue that Mark is the earliest is because it's shorter and sparser. It doesn't, for example, have any infant narratives of Jesus in it. Jesus just kind of hits the ground running as an adult with the baptism and temptation in the wilderness and begins his ministry. So it's shorter, but almost everything that's in the Gospel of Mark is also in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. And that's part of what we'll talk about next time, is what we call these three as the synoptic Gospels, because syn means together, S-Y-N, optic, you see them together. You can look at them all together and you can see they're related. And Matthew and Luke include almost everything that's in Mark, and then they also include a lot of other things that the two of them have in common that are not in Mark, and then they each have their own individual differences as well. So if you just think genealogically, it makes sense that Mark was the original and that these two drew from Mark as well as from other sources in developing Matthew and Luke. And in a couple places, it appears, for example, that Matthew corrects something that in Mark, like Mark quotes a passage that's actually two different biblical passages. He quotes it as one, and Matthew sorts those out, and so there's a kind of editing going on there as well. So that's the Gospel of Mark is the earliest. The other synoptic Gospels, Matthew and Luke, come a little later. And most would argue that the Gospel of John, which is very different from the synoptic Gospels in all kinds of ways, probably comes later than that. But some argue that it is earlier than scholars have thought. The latest texts that are in the New Testament canon are probably what we call the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And I mentioned earlier, these most would argue are pseudonymous, pseudo-Pauline, that is to say. They claim to be letters of Paul, but most would argue that they're not. And they probably come from the early 100s, like in those early decades of the 2nd century Common Era. Lots of different reasons for that argument. As I mentioned, different vocabulary and sometimes using words that Paul used one way in a different way. But also the reason we call them the pastoral epistles is because they seem very concerned and focused on the organization of the church and kind of the structuring of it. This is where you get women should be silent. You get other kind of rules around the organization of the church, which suggests maybe a less of an orientation that we get in Paul's writings, where it's like, this is all going to be over tomorrow. Jesus is going to come back, and and there's no reason to get married or anything, right? Because this is super short term, and here we are then in the early 2nd century, and we're kind of maybe settling in for the long haul a little bit more, and so there's more of a focus on organizing the household of the church and that sort of thing. So that's some of the arguments for why those are considered later. So really, yeah, we're looking at 27 documents that date anywhere from the early 50s to the early 2nd century, about probably 70 years or something like that of history or of original context. That's the when. And then how? How did we get from the many, perhaps hundreds of different early Christian gospels, letters, apocalyptic writings, and so on, that were scripture for various Christian communities throughout the Roman Empire? How did we get from that kind of scenario of this decentralized Jesus movement all over the Roman Empire with maybe hundreds, certainly many dozens of different texts and different versions of texts in this kind of loose network of sharing. How did we get from that to a closed canon? You know that word canon, it just means something like, with one N, it just means something like an official list, or something like that, an official list or official collection. So how did we get to a closed canon of 27 documents, no more, no less, these ones and not other ones, that we call the New Testament? And it's a very complicated and long answer, but a couple things to think about. One is the establishment of Christianity as the sort of state religion of the Roman Empire in the early 4th century, in the early 300s. And this is just a little bit, but even when that happened, still there wasn't a standardization that happened really quickly. So this is 325 Common Era, and this is Eusebius, very influential early historian of Christianity, who was writing ecclesiastical history under the direction of Constantine, the emperor who kind of made Rome a Christian empire. And here he's talking about all of the different texts that are out there, all of the different early Christian scriptures that are out there. And remember, this is 325 Common Era, so we've already got a lot of history of circulating of these texts. And what's really interesting when you look at this is that it's clear that there is no closed canon yet at this point, this many centuries later. He basically breaks up the scriptures that are out there. He's kind of describing the ways, the different texts and who uses them, and he kind of breaks them down into, these are the ones almost everybody agrees on. That's the first paragraph there. These are the ones that some agree on and others disagree on, don't think should be included. And then these, in the third paragraph, are the ones that really are fake or spurious and should be kicked out of, should not be included as authoritative and scriptural. So I'm going to read this quickly because it is interesting. I'm watching the clock. We're doing all right. Since we are dealing with this subject, it is proper to sum up the writings of the New Testament which have been already mentioned. First, then, must be put the Holy Quaternion of Gospels. That's the 4 Gospels that presumably are the same ones we still have. Following them, the Acts of the Apostles, and remember that Luke and the Acts of the Apostles are a 2-part story. They go together. After this must be reckoned the epistles of Paul, which he doesn't name, so we don't know if the epistles that are in our New Testament are the same ones. Next in order, the extant former epistle of John, that is 1 John, and likewise the epistle of Peter, that is 1 Peter, must be maintained. After them is to be placed, if it really seem proper, because it's disputed, the Apocalypse of John, concerning which we shall give the different opinions at the proper time. These then belong among the accepted homolegomena, same voice, of one voice with one another, in unison with one another, writings, right? So we've got 1 John, we've got 1 Peter, we've got maybe not the Apocalypse of John, and we've got Paul's letters in that one that everybody mostly agrees on. Among the disputed anti-legomena writings, which are nevertheless recognized by many, are extant the so-called Epistle of James and that of Jude, also the second epistle of Peter, and those that are called 2nd and 3rd of John, whether they belong to the evangelist or to another person of the same name. He's already starting, he's acknowledging that there are disagreements about whether 2nd and 3rd John were written by the John that wrote 1 John, for example, right? But he's describing this. So these are the texts that some embrace and some reject. Among the rejected, Notha, spurious or false texts writings, must be reckoned also the Acts of Paul, which, by the way, is an amazing text that has survived, and you should read it, especially the story of Thecla in the Acts of Paul. It's called Paul and Thecla, and it was so popular in early Christianity that it became its own sort of separate short story and would get circulated by itself separate from the larger document known as the Acts of Paul. The Acts of Paul and the so-called shepherd, which is I believe that's the Didache, the teachings, and the Apocalypse of Peter. There was an Apocalypse of Peter. And in addition to these, the extant epistles of Barnabas and the so-called teachings of the apostles, and besides, as I said, the Apocalypse of John, if it seems proper, which some, as I said, reject, but which others class with the accepted books. So already in the 4th century, the Apocalypse of John, the book of Revelation, is really polarizing, right? You've got some who absolutely reject it and some who absolutely find it core. So it isn't even in the middle category. So that's 325 Eusebius describing what the lay of the land looked like for these documents at that time. Now here's 367 Common Era, not very long after, and this is from Athanasius, who was a bishop and kind of a controversial figure. He had a lot of power when he was in power, and then somebody else would come in power, and he'd be off in exile, and then he'd make it back. And he was very, contestatory. And this is in a letter that he wrote on Easter. And in this letter, he lists, and this is the first time we have it, 367 Common Era, the same 27 texts that are now in our New Testament. Again, it is not tedious to speak of the books of the New Testament. These are the 4 Gospels, according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Afterwards, the Acts of Apostles and epistles. 7, that is to say, the 2 of James, the 1 of Peter, 2 of John, 3 after these, the 3 Johns, Jude, and in addition there are 14 epistles of Paul written in this order, and he goes through the order of them, and then finally to the Revelation of John. These are the fountains of salvation, that they who thirst may be satisfied with the living words they contain. In these alone is proclaimed the doctrine of godliness. Let no man add to these, neither let him take aught from these. For concerning these the Lord put to shame the Sadducees and said, Ye do err, not knowing the Scriptures. And he reproved the Jews, saying, Search the Scriptures, for these are they that testify of me. So a kind of threatening assertion of this as the closed canon of the New Testament, these 27 texts. So by then, at least some, including Athanasius, argued that this was the closed canon. Now, why did he have to write this? Because other people didn't agree, right? You don't write something like this if it's all completely agreed upon, right? So it was certainly still controversial then, what should be included and what should not be. Now, I think something for us to just reflect on that's a huge factor, and this is something I write a lot about in a book I did called The Rise and Fall of the Bible, the unexpected history of an accidental book, or maybe it's the accidental history of an unexpected book. I can never remember because my editor gave it that subtitle. So, but a major factor in the kind of closing of the canon, or the establishment of this New Testament as a canonical official collection of texts is media history, is media technology. Of course, it's also the establishment of Christianity as state religion, and that starts to lead to, well, we need to set some rules, we need to have a canon, we need to have what's in, what's out, hierarchy, and all of that kind of stuff. But media history, media technology is really important too. It's a major factor because what happened, especially by the 4th century, was really so it's about the codex, and the codex is just the Greek word for a bound book. It began early on in maybe the 1st century as a very, very simple kind of thing, probably originally 2 wax plates that you could write on and then erase for like keeping lists and stuff like that. Quite early on, there were little fascicles, where you could take a sheet of parchment or a sheet of papyrus and fold it and fold it and fold it and get several sheets out of it, or even just a fold over 2 sheets. But over time, the codex really developed into the dominant media technology for literature, but not during the time of Jesus and not really even well into the 2nd century. It developed over time so that by the time you get to the 4th century, it is possible to make a book that's big enough to put a whole Bible in it, or that's big enough to put all of Paul's letters in it, or that's big enough to put some of the prophets together in it, or that's big enough to put all the Gospels together in it, or something like that. And so what we have here in this picture is one of those early codices. It's called Codex Sinaiticus, and it is a copy, a book version of the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. And so this was, big enough to be able to hold all of those together. Verses in the 1st, 2nd centuries, and much longer in Jewish media history, Hebrew Scriptures were in scroll form, right? So Isaiah would have been, I can't remember how many feet long, 40-some feet long maybe, made from parchment, that is from animal skin, and you would read it that way. The invention of the codex made all kinds of other sort of user experiences, if you will, to use media technology language possible. You could suddenly move back and forth very quickly between different texts. You could connect up different texts quickly by jumping back and forth on pages versus having to roll your way back and forth to find anything, right? So all kinds of things began to happen there, and one of them was just the sheer possibility of being able to put everything together in a bound volume like this. The picture on the right, you can almost see. I'm so used to this is how old I am. I'm thinking overhead projectors. So I just about went and I was like, if I point to it on my finger on this laptop, it's going to show up there. This is a close-up of one of those pages on the right here, and the reason I include it, you see kind of a little dark, some unusual dark lines. Guess what those are? Veins. That's skin. These codices and scrolls were made from, parchment is skin, and all of the media technology around making things you write on from skin. So just remembering the animals that helped make this book. So that's that, and then to just reflect momentarily for a minute, and I'm not sure how I'm going to do this. Do you have a Bible? Can I get a Bible? Oh, here's a Bible. No, these are all hymnals. There's no Bible in this place. If I could get a Bible, that'd be great. Oh, thanks. So, yeah. This is dangerous. I don't know what translation this is. Is this going to be like the Living Bible? Oh, good. Okay. So, Luke 4, the story in Luke 4 that starts at verse 16, that's the story where Jesus he's in Nazareth, he's in his hometown, and he stands up to read from Scripture in a Shabbat service, in a synagogue, which just means a gathering place. It could have been a house church. We don't really know much about what synagogues looked like during the 1st century. Most of our archaeological evidence is much, much later than that. Someday, if we go on an Israel-Palestine trip, we'll learn more about that. So one thing that's kind of interesting about this, if we think of the Gospel of Luke as being late 1st century, maybe 80s, Common Era or something like that, this is one of the earliest accounts of what happens in a Jewish synagogue service. I believe it might even be the earliest description of a service. But at any rate, this is where Jesus stands up and reads, and I'm just going to read it, the story, and then we can talk a little bit about it. When he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Very similar to our Isaiah passage this morning, right? And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." So I won't go on. It's interesting. They're impressed. And so he says something more to sort of piss them off, it seems like. And then they try to throw him off a cliff and all kinds of things. But at any rate, so let's just try to kind of bring this story to life a little bit more. It's certainly nothing like me standing up here and reading this just now. For one, he stood up to read, so there's some kind of ritual, act there that either he initiated or was invited to initiate, but they brought him the scroll of Isaiah. Why? Because they had a big basket or box or something of various different scrolls, scriptures. They weren't all in one Bible where he could just go, find it that way. And so he was brought, that was chosen, whether it was part of a lectionary or something like that, we don't know. But he then found his way. Remember, this is a scroll many feet long, made out of skins, and almost for sure, and you'd have to roll your way around in that to find, and whether it was, basically at that spot when he began to read, or whether he chose it more intentionally, open question. Most believe that he chose it, but we can't really argue that for sure. But it would have been this scroll. It would have been somewhat awkward in some ways. And where he read it, probably in some kind of a space that was set aside for people to gather on Shabbat, maybe some kind of seating, some sort of place where you read, whether a lectern or something else like that. And what I like to imagine and think about is how did he read it? Because the way people, including Jewish people, read literature in the first century in Palestine and throughout the empire, really, was that they canted it. They sang it. And so Jesus would have sung this. Jesus would have canted this text. Just something to think about. And it wouldn't have sounded like Ian Gillian in Jesus Christ Superstar. So I just like to think about that. And then when he says this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing, he's talking about not just the words maybe. He's talking about the enactment of this text in a melodic, rhythmic, canted form of some kind. And that just sort of, for me, makes me think, well, that means in some way I don't have access to that except through my imagination, because I wasn't there for it to be fulfilled in my hearing in that same embodied, resonant way. So that's just, I find that fascinating to reflect on. And I think we'll stop there for some conversation. So thank you. Yeah, Scott. Oh, okay. I can repeat the questions too.
Oh, hello. Very good. Okay. The reason that we need people to, you're saying you just would repeat?
I could. Yeah.
Okay, because we're being.
That's fine. Why don't you go ahead and.
Okay.
Yeah.
Here. Yep, Scott.
Thank you, Tim. That was great. So just to follow up on where you left off. So after people had heard this canting by Jesus or witnessed this event, how did the legacy of that event survive to the point where someone wrote it down in a gospel? Was it an oral tradition from then to that point, or do you think it was in the newspaper the next day? How did that survive that event to how we can still read about it today?
Yeah, almost for sure not that last possibility. It's pretty much invisible to the larger empire, what was happening in the Jesus movement. I think we're going to talk a little bit about this next week too. In the Gospel of Luke, the writer, we'll just say Luke, but whoever it was, we'll say she. She says at the beginning and addresses this person Theophilus, who could be a made-up name because that means lover of God, or it could be an actual person who, whether they contracted this history to be written or whether they were just an interested person or something, but addresses Theophilus and says something to the effect of, inasmuch as others have gone back to the sources and collected things and put them together and done their research and come and put together this historia, this narrative, I too am going to do that now, which is really interesting because it means on the one hand there were others out there doing this, and that what you were doing was you were collecting and collecting the different sources as they had been handed down from those eyewitnesses. That's part of what she says there. And I'm going to do it too. So on the one hand, these are sources that have been handed down. On the other hand, it's a matter of interpretation, what you do with this research and how you put this together. So that is a little bit of a window into that process. These stories must have been oral traditions, certainly, and maybe there were written sources as well. There were disagreements on what went where or what should be included and what should not be included, and this only shows up in the Gospel of Luke, this particular story. It could be a source that Luke had that others did not have. It's all conjecture, it's all speculation, but you do have that evidence there and other places that a lot of this was passed down orally. And in fact, there's another letter, I forget when it dates to, maybe in the early 90s, but it's someone saying that they are aware that there are these written gospels, but that they prefer the gospel as the living word, meaning prefer to continue to have it as oral tradition that's passed down. So that's a part of an answer to that. No social media, no New York Times the next morning.
I know, no heels. It'd be way easier.
Good morning.
Morning.
Along the lines of what you were just talking about, I'm really curious what you know about literacy at the time, because that was what was striking me, is like, how was it that Jesus could read or not read, or all the communities there? I mean, I feel like in the Middle Ages it was very much the pastors and that's it, but what was going on at that time in terms of literacy versus the world?
Really important question. But, lower than the Middle Ages would be a short answer probably, but very, very low if what you're talking about is being able to look at script on a page and sound it out. Even just sound it out, and that was considered literate. There were scribes who basically just sort of copied without really being able to read, or maybe they could sound it out but not, necessarily read the way we think of reading. So there was that, but the way we think about literacy, very, very low. I forget, it's in that same book, Rise and Fall of the Bible, but very low percentage, maybe slightly higher in Jewish, worship culture, where you had texts that were central. But if we think about literacy more broadly as being familiar through hearing things being read aloud, then you can imagine it being broader. But that's the key thing about oral reading, about reading aloud. And texts were not read silently. You didn't take them home and read them on your bedside to yourself or whatever like that. They were read aloud. And so if we think of literacy in that broader sense of hearing, then there could be a great deal of familiarity with many of these texts that would be familiar having been read many times over years and over a lifetime.
So mine's a little controversial. I hope that's okay.
Sure.
In the truest sense, I don't expect you to answer this now, but I wondered if you're going to cover these things over this 6 weeks or 8 weeks we're having together. One is church councils in gathering the text together.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The other one is the inerrancy of Scripture that's taught so commonly these days. And then the other is literal interpretation versus more of a subjective or spiritual interpretation of Scripture.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
I don't expect all those now, but will those be talked about?
I appreciate it. Yeah, and not so much the councils that determine the closed canon and Chalcedon and those that are a little bit later. But yeah, these questions of inerrancy and authority and what do we mean by scriptural authority and reading quote-unquote literally versus more quote-unquote subjectively and those kinds of things we'll definitely get into. Just since you said you wanted to be a little controversial, I'll throw a couple things out right now that might feel a little controversial or maybe won't. One is that when Paul, in one of those letters, says all Scripture is inspired, God-breathed and inspired and authoritative, is Paul talking about the Gospels? No, because they were not written yet. Is Paul talking about the book of Revelation? No, it was not written yet. His own letters? Probably not. I doubt it. Paul was for sure talking about the Torah, maybe talking about the prophets, which is that next collection of texts in the Jewish scriptures, and maybe talking about most or all of the writings, but some of those were still controversial in rabbinic Jewish circles later, like Song of Songs and Esther were controversial texts. And so, talking about Hebrew scriptures in some sense, maybe Torah and prophets, but certainly not about his letters or other New Testament texts. So that's part of the importance of thinking of this as a collection and not a book, so that we don't anachronistically make Paul's claim about inerrancy applicable to things that didn't even exist, that he couldn't have been referring to. Another one that we'll often hear around the arguments around inerrancy and so forth is at the end of the book of Revelation, and that's what Athanasius uses there by saying, don't add or take away anything from this list. At the end of the book of Revelation, the writer says, don't add or take anything away. Anybody who does will be hit with all of the curses described in this book, and that's a lot. It's a pretty violent book, but again, just because that's at the end of our current shape of our Bible and of our New Testament, it's not the end of the Bible. It's the end of the book of Revelation, and it's talking about that particular text. And to problematize that more, we have different versions of the book of Revelation that have differences in them that are significant. The mark of the beast, for example, is 616 in one manuscript tradition. So we've got problems if we're worried about taking away or adding, since it obviously happened. So those are, and then I think we can go deeper for sure when we start looking, for example, at the Gospels, the four Gospels, even something like who was there at the empty tomb. It's a list of different women in each of the Gospels. What happened at the empty tomb? It's a little bit different in the Gospels, right? There's a young man outside. There's an angel, and so on. What was said? What happened? And so, my short answer to that is that we impoverish the Bible when we try to make it all say the same thing. That what we find in this, what I call not a book of answers, but a library of questions, is a collection of scriptures that is not uncomfortable with contradiction, not uncomfortable with disagreement, and is doing that all the time. The book of Job is arguing with the book of Proverbs and Deuteronomy and so on like this, and that we impoverish it when we try to get it to be univocal, of one voice with itself, or inerrant in that sense, and when we think that we can read it literally versus otherwise. And I think Jesus and Paul are models in the New Testament of interpreters of inherited scripture. They do very creative things with the Torah and with the prophets, the ways they read them. You know, the Sermon on the Mount, you've heard it said, but I say, and every time he's reinterpreting a text in a surprising way. And Paul does some of that too. So that's a bit of an answer, but I hope that this is part of the conversation we'll have the whole 8 weeks.
I think it's almost 10:30, right? Unless there's one more question, let's call this to a close. Is that okay? All right. Tim, thank you so much. We look forward to next week.
Appreciate it.
We look forward to next week. Thank you so much for coming, all of you. And in 8 weeks, oh my gosh, just how Bible nerds you're going to be.